2012. And I'm pleased to be invited to help us all navigate together Gender Identity 101. I want to say something right off the bat, and that is that I approach all these conversations and really this entire work from the posture of a learner. I am quite sure that there are amongst our audience today, those of you that probably know more about gender identity than I do. I've had my own gender identity journey, and I continue to learn about myself, about just the extraordinary expansiveness and diversity when we start talking about these topics. So I would encourage you all to adopt a similar posture of curiosity and learning. And hopefully today there'll be some new stuff, but I'm sure some of the stuff will be stuff you've heard before. So with that said, let's get started. So I want us to think about human beings. When we think about a human being, and my human being in this particular picture is deliberately undefinable, right? An icon of a head and a shoulders just to indicate a person. All right, so if we were to try and find photographs of that would represent the full diversity of humanity on this planet, it would be an impossible task. But some of the things about us as human beings, there are elements about us that we are born with. There are elements about us that we gather through our family structures and community structures, the geographic locations of where we live, the economic status and situation that we're born into, geographically across the world where we are, our racial and ethnic identities, our physical characteristics. My hair is brown, there's some gray coming in at the side. The color of our eyes, I happen to be left-handed. So there are so many things about us as human beings. And what we're going to talk about today specifically is about gender identity, but I want to set that aspect of us in the context of the many, many ways in which there are various identities that we embody. And this is a component of our identities, right? And so just to bear that in mind, I think sometimes our sexual orientation, our gender identity, our gender expression, because they have become such controversial, sadly, subjects as we've grown up and sort of understood things more. I think sometimes it's helpful to know just the plethora of different things that make us who we are. Some of those things bring us privilege, and some of those things put us in a marginalized status. Some of us embody many elements of our identities that would give us privilege. For example, I am white, I have white privilege. I'm agender, I am queer, so I don't have cis straight privilege, right? But we all have different ways in which we have privilege in our lives and ways in which we may not experience that. So just to have that again as a context, as a background to our conversation today. So there is a series, do they call it an acronym or an abbreviation when there are letters in a row? Anyway, I can't hear you, but it's either an acronym or an abbreviation. I don't remember which. But the idea of SOGIE, S-O-G-I-E, is a term that is commonly used to talk about sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. And if there's one thing that especially that I would like you to take away from our 101 today, is that just because somebody has a certain sexual orientation does not necessarily mean they have a certain gender identity, and does not necessarily mean they have a certain gender expression. These three things exist entirely separate from one another. And I think oftentimes, and I was absolutely guilty of this myself, and I still fall into the trap of making assumptions, is that we assume that if somebody, for example, let's say a trans man, they are going to want to have a gender expression that is specifically masculine. These two things are entirely separate. So sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression exist entirely separately from one another. And we need to remember that as we're considering people's identities and how they live in the world, right? So I wanted just to say that off the bat. So remember they're completely separate, and remember not to make assumptions. I could probably talk for an hour about the embarrassing situations I have got myself into because I have assumed I knew somebody's sexual orientation, or I have assumed I knew somebody's gender identity based on how they looked. Don't do it. Just let me give you that gift of advice today. It's just not a good idea. Okay. All right. So another thing to mention when we're talking about gender identity is what we call the curiosity continuum. There is an aspect of our humanity, our human makeup, that makes us curious and makes us want to understand other people. It makes us want to, we have this desire to categorize. When I meet somebody, I want to have a sense of I know who you are. And so what that can do is that can help, that can sort of lead us to making assumptions, number one, and it can lead us to wanting to ask questions that should never be asked. So when we're thinking about our curiosity of people, we like to think about the idea of hospitable curiosity and intrusive curiosity. And we always want to stay on the end of hospitable curiosity. That means asking questions, not asking questions that are inappropriate to ask of anybody, never mind a trans person. Okay, so as you're thinking about learning about gender identity, which I'm thrilled you want to learn about and understand more about, it's rarely appropriate to ask questions of a deeply personal nature of another human being. Unless you have a long-standing history of deep friendship and relationship, then it's best not to do that. It's best to stick with hospitable, kind, non-controversial ways of getting to know people in a hospitable way. If you have specific questions about gender identity and trans people, there is an internet. Now, yes, we have to be discerning about the information we find on the internet. Don't assume everything you find is going to be okay. But there are ways of finding out information that don't require personal questions to individual people. So just be aware of that, again, as we're on this journey of education and learning and understanding, that you seek to be hospitable, courteous, appropriate, and not intrusive. Okay. Emily, if people are having, I can't see the chat thing. So if there are questions coming up while I'm talking, I'm perfectly fine hitting pause and answering questions as we go. But I can't see the questions. So if you just want to wave at me or interrupt.
Gotcha. Thank you so much. And that's a good reminder that you're welcome to use the chat throughout our time together today. Thanks.
I'm gonna make another confession. I love presenting information in person, but it's really weird doing it when you can't hear people. It's nice. It's nice to see your nodding heads and smiles, and that's really cool, but it's also really weird. Okay, so please do ask questions in the chat. I'm happy to stop and pause and answer anything you might have. All right, so what's the first question? Actually, let's do this. Write in the chat. What's the first question that's asked when a baby is born? You can write it in the chat. I'll give you a second or two to write it in the chat. And actually, let me see if I can actually look at the chat. No, apparently I can't. Well, I'm sure I can, but for some reason. Oh, there we go. I found it. Yes, haha, very good. All right, I'm seeing the answers. Yes, the first question, the very first question that's asked when a baby is born, is it a boy or is it a girl? Honestly, I'm not sure we're ever going to get to the point where that isn't a question. We might aspire to that, but that's a hardwired kind of way for people to think. All right. And it immediately throws us into what's called the gender binary system. It throws us into this paradigm of thinking, which says people are either this or they're this. They're male or they're female. And a checkbox is checked, and henceforth that child is deemed to inherit certain characteristics, is assumed to inherit certain characteristics because of the box that is checked at birth. And I love that, Susie. Thank you. Is everybody okay? Excellent question as an alternative. We'll add that to a learning thing for today. I love that. Thanks. So based on that single question, is it a boy, is it a girl? The checkbox that is checked. There are assumptions made about all kinds of things. One, that child will adopt a certain gender identity. So if the box of female is checked, woman will be identified as the gender identity female, and male for a boy. Okay. Gender expression, there's going to be some assumptions, and this is the first thing. This is the very first way in which I veered from the path on this was, what's the gender expression? What kind of clothing, what kind of way of being in the world expression is that baby going to adopt? I was having a conversation with my mum, who is still in England, by the way, if you're wondering where the accent came from. I had a conversation with my mum just this weekend, and she told the story, which I tell pretty much every time I do this training, about me at 5 years old. We had a family wedding to go to, and I point blank refused to wear the dress. 5 years old. I had a very clear idea of how I wanted to present myself in the world, and it didn't include a dress. So gender expression, we make assumptions about that. And then sexual orientation. Who are we going to grow up and marry? I found out again over this conversation over the weekend that at some point my grandmother had asked my mother, who is Helen going to marry and when? I don't know at what point, how old I was when this question was asked. And I don't know what my mum knew about me at that time, whether I'd come out or not. But mum said she answered it by saying, well, Helen kind of belongs to everybody. So maybe she won't get married. At that point, my pronouns were still she, her. So anyway, so all these assumptions are made because of a box that's checked at birth. Now, I want to mention one other thing that happens in a small but significant percentage of births, and that is children, babies who are born intersex. They have chromosomal differences that result in ambiguous genitalia, and they are intersex. Now, even those babies historically have been forced into a particular gender and gender identity because of the medical profession. That is happening less and less, but it's still something we need to be drawing attention to, paying attention to, and making sure that children, babies who are born intersex are given the proper medical care and allowed to develop as themselves without being forced down a certain path. Erin, I see your question about definitions, and I'm going to get to some definitions in just a minute. We're getting to that. Okay, any questions about that slide, the assumptions that are made based upon that first question? You can put it in the chat if you've got another question. All right, we'll just keep going. Let me see what's next. Okay. So I want to introduce you to a couple of terms that you may have heard or may not have heard, and these are related specifically to gender identity. Gender identity is the sense of genderedness that a person experiences. And that may be an identity that is on the sort of far ends of the binary of gender identity. So it may be specifically identifying as male or female, but as we are increasingly understanding, and again, as I understood myself pretty late in life, there is a space within gender identity that is neither male nor female, that is non-binary. When we're talking about gender, there are two terms that it's important to be aware of. Cisgender is a term that's used for a person whose gender matches the one that they are assigned at birth. So if, when that question's asked as a baby, boy or a girl, the baby is assigned male, and that child grows up to identify as male, then that child would be considered cisgender. But if when a baby is born and assigned male at birth, but the child grows up and identifies as female or not the one that they're assigned at birth, they would be known, they would be transgender. So cis is the Greek for same, and trans is the Greek for across. So cisgender and transgender are two terms it's useful to be aware of when we're having this conversation. I myself identify as agender, and agender means without gender, and that's the most comfortable, that's the one that feels most like home to me. I identify as agender, and that means without gender. I like to say there's a gender train somewhere over there, and I don't want to be on it. I'm quite fine for you all to be on the gender train, but it's not my train. So that's how I identify. But the fact of the matter is, there are more than two genders. We've mentioned already a couple of times the fact that this gender binary system really doesn't work. And it's hard to kind of graphically interpret what's something that is, I kind of call it an amorphous rainbow blob. I don't know if that's an appropriate term, it probably isn't. But when we try it, when we're thinking in terms of binary, we think of something like with one end and another end. And even having a spectrum, right? You can see that line at the top kind of moves between male on one end and female on the other end. Even that is constrained within two kind of ends of one thing. And I think it's much more helpful to think about gender identity as more of a spectrum, as more of a way of thinking about things. And again, that's very hard to kind of visualize, to kind of give a helpful visual representation of that, but it's very helpful not to be thinking about this or this. I think as a culture, Western culture, I would say maybe is true to say this, is that we have made some strides around how we understand things. And I love that question. My favorite question to ask, thanks, John, people is, what color is your gender? I don't know. I'm going to have to think of an answer for that now. But I love the question. Thank you. We have made progress. Let's just talk about the United States. There has been some progress. All right. There is more understanding about sexual orientation, about who we are attracted to sexually or physically. That side of things is more easily understood. The notion of being gay versus straight, of being lesbian, of being bisexual, those things have been more quickly and easily understood. The conversation about gender identity is taking a little bit longer. And then now we're moving into this whole idea of a gender spectrum, of not being on a binary of things, gender fluidity. It's like we're going, through another layer of uncovering and understanding how we are in the world and who we are in the world. So I think this rainbow kind of blob, there has to be a better word. I'm going to work on a better word for that. I don't like that word, but it'll work for now. I think helps us kind of get a better sense of really what we're talking about when we're talking about gender. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to bring up is a slide that we have used, a wheel. Yes, a cloud. You see, a rainbow cloud. That is so much nicer. Or a color palette. I like that too. All right, I'm removing blob from my repertoire there. That's good. All right, so this is the gender unicorn. We've been using this at RMN for some time for trainings on sexual orientation and gender identity and gender expression. This resource comes from transstudent.org. Emily has a link and may put it in the chat. So if you want to get the webpage that this came from, it came from there. I will say we have been having a conversation. We've been having conversation for a very long time that it would be really nice to be able to talk about all these things without having to sort of use a mythical, if you know, kind of fun cartoon character because trans people are not mythical cartoon characters. We're real people. Okay. So there are some limitations with this kind of way of explaining gender identity and sexual orientation and so on. But we don't have, like, at the moment, we haven't found anything that sort of encapsulates the different conversations as clearly as this one does. But just bear that in mind. It would be good to have something else. All right, so the gender unicorn lays out some of the definitions and words and ideas that I've been speaking about so far. And we're really mainly going to focus on the top two, gender identity and gender expression, which we're going to get to more. Sex assigned at birth is what we've already talked about, is the physical characteristics of a baby at birth, which determines their sex assigned at birth. Sexual attraction, sexual orientation relates to how is a person, which people are people sexually attracted to. That is sexual orientation. There is also an understanding that romantic and emotional orientations can be separate from sexual attraction and orientation. So this speaks to that as well. And notice that under each one, we don't have that binary. We don't have this or this. We have these kind of three tracks of female and male, and then other, which might be non-gender or agender or so on. So I'm going to take a deeper dive into gender identity, which is actually what we're here for. All right, so gender identity has to do with how a person identifies in terms of their gender. So I'm gonna tell you my personal story, and I think we may have hopefully a couple of other folks who can tell their own story on this call too, if they'd like to. But when I was born, as I already said, at 5 years old, I was already pretty clear about the fact that I didn't want to wear a dress to a wedding. And so I would have been considered a tomboy at that point. I was definitely different from the other girls in the playground. I had a sense of that difference. I kind of knew there was something different about me. Didn't have language for it, had no idea what it was. And as I got a little bit older, into my teenage years, I understood myself to be attracted to women and identified as a lesbian, but definitely a lesbian who was more on the masculine side of things than the feminine side of things, for want of a better word. And that's where I kind of lived in my understanding of myself until my late 40s, early 50s, which, let me just say, is very old to be getting a new revelation about yourself. But even as I was doing this job, I began to understand or learn about the fact that gender identity didn't have to be on a binary. It didn't have to be one or the other. I got to know, during my time doing this work, many people whose stories looked pretty identical to mine up to a certain point. And the point of departure was they finally came to understand themselves as trans men, as people who had been assigned female at birth, but whose gender identity was male. And I was always quite clear that I was not a boy and did not want to be a boy. I was also quite clear that everyone thought I was a girl, but I didn't really know what that meant. But I was just kind of making do with where that landed me. That's just how things were, until I was introduced to this idea of non-binary gender identity, or being agender. And when that happened, there was a second layer of, oh, that's who I am. And a new sort of sense of understanding myself, which I realized was there from a very, very early age, but I never had language for. So probably for about the last 5 or 6 years, maybe, I've been identifying as agender. And in more recent years, I have changed my pronouns to they, them, to indicate that I don't use female pronouns. So that's just one person's journey of gender identity. That's my journey of gender identity. That's not everyone's. I honestly think it's really a mistake to assume that, in the same way we've kind of assumed certain things about all gay people and all lesbians. There's been this kind of assumption that all trans people's journeys are the same. You know, we hear this story of always felt uncomfortable in their body, or always felt that they were different on the inside than they were on the outside. But I think what's really important with this conversation about gender identity is that we don't lock people into any single story. Everyone's story around their journey to understanding their gender identity is different. There are similarities, of course there are, but everyone's is different. I think if I would encourage you to take anything from this, it would be to be open to the fact that, or to not assume that people have taken the same path to where they have landed in terms of their gender identity journey.
Helen, if we can, at this point, Dan is on with us now.
I can see Dan. Would you like to jump in, Dan? I would love you to, if you would.
He's happy to.
Please, go to it.
Dan, if you'll introduce yourself real quickly and share what you would like to in this space.
I'm gonna stop sharing.
Yeah, that sounds good. Thanks.
All right.
Dan.
So my name is Dan Levine. I am a licensed local pastor in Atlanta and a member of the New York Annual Conference. I serve as the convener for the United Methodist Alliance for Transgender Inclusion. And I think that after Helen's presentation, I'll go into a little bit more detail about what that is and what we do. But from my journey, it took me quite a while to understand how I felt, but I understood, as Helen said, at a very young age. I remember in preschool, I was the one, I couldn't stand playing with the girls. There was nothing that gave me more dread, even in preschool and earlier than that. I was a tomboy. I had mostly guy friends throughout middle school, elementary school, and high school. And it was just, I didn't understand. I didn't have the language, I think is the best way to put it, until I was about 30 years old. I was almost 30 years old when I came out. And it was because I didn't have the language. We didn't have the language at that point to express. I remember in second grade putting out into words in my classroom that I was a boy. I wasn't a girl, I was a boy. And I came from a pretty conservative hometown, and my grandmother worked in the school system. So the people in my elementary school chastised me and corrected me on multiple occasions. And really just, I was teased and bullied by both staff and students for expressing something that was outside of the norm, so to speak. But I never forgot that. And the moment I had language that fit with what I was feeling from a very young age, most of us know at a very young age that our bodies and our brains and the way society wants to fit us into a box doesn't match up. And so that is one of the things that I find so freeing right now for young people these days, is the opportunity and that there is the language available to them. And so I'm so excited that you are all here to learn more about this. So I think that's at this point about it. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Dan. I really appreciate you sharing a little of your journey. And John is also here and is connected with UMATI and is willing to share a little bit about their journey. And so, John, if you will share.
Thank you. That might actually be the first time I've heard somebody like even in person use they, so that was really great. Thank you. Yeah, so my name is John Ongermeyer. Pronouns are he, they. The they pronouns are new for me, because gender for me is an ever evolving thing. And I think gender creative is a new term that I saw in the presentation that I might be adopting, because it's about the best I can come up with at this point. But yeah, my journey is a little bit different. I was the tomboy. I was assigned female at birth, first of all. And then I was the tomboy. I had mostly guy friends, played with dump trucks instead of Barbies and that kind of thing. But I was okay with being called a girl and being called she. And I would occasionally wear dresses, but the older I got, the more it was like only if my grandma makes them. And I told my mom when I was like 7 years old, apparently, I told my mom something like, I like wearing grandma's dresses because it feels like a hug from grandma. And so it wasn't necessarily the dress, it was the connotations behind it. And it was like, I mean, if she made me a suit, I would have worn that too. She made suits for my cousins, so, but she didn't know, and I didn't know at the time that that was what would have made me more comfortable, I guess, at least on a conscious level. And it wasn't, I came out as a lesbian in high school, towards the tail end of high school, and identified that way for about 5 years. And towards the tail end of college, I started questioning my gender. And it was never a conscious question until I was in my early 20s. I was maybe 20, 21 years old when I started this journey. And having struggled with my sexuality in high school, I was like, I'm not doing this 2.5 year thing again. We're just going to figure it out and go for it. And like within 6 months, I was coming out as trans, having people switch pronouns, things like that. And that was in 2012, I believe. And so I've been in transition for about 8 years. But within the last, I want to say 6 months or so, there's been some non-gendered feelings that have sort of bubbled up to the surface. And so gender creative, like literally the only way I can put words to it is prehistoric tree. So that is probably like a gender identity 301 or something like that. Or that's like a non-binary 101 kind of thing. But it's not male, it's not female, it's just sort of this amorphous other energy that's inside. And that's the only way I can describe it. And so that's why I decided to start using he, they pronouns. But yeah, this concept of gender fluidity is fascinating to me, and it's been really, really instructive and constructive as well in my journey. So yeah.
Thank you so much, John, for sharing. And Helen, I'll turn it back over to you to continue us on our journey together today.
That's just so great. I'm so glad to have John and Dan's stories, because it's so much of a mistake to consider that one story can possibly encompass all the ways in which gender identity expresses itself. And I would hazard a guess that even for those who are cisgender on the call, there might be some resonance around some of this stuff. And there's a slide that speaks to that in a minute. So gender identity, John just noticed that there was gender creative. There are different terms around this. I think one thing to definitely consider is this idea of gender fluidity, this idea of gender identity not necessarily having to be something that's fixed, but that can change over time, that a person's understanding of themselves can change over time. I think sometimes in the faith community, we have become comfortable with definitely like, okay, if a person definitely feels like they're this, and we can do all our theology around it, and okay, that feels comfortable. I think we are still boxing in God when we put those requirements down, that we have an expansive God who has created an extraordinary universe and has depths of creativity that we completely can't understand. And it's not at all surprising to me that creativity and diversity is expressed through human beings and human bodies. So that's gender identity. I will quickly make a note of a gender expression. And this is definitely where that whole thing about not making assumptions comes into play. we can get ourselves in a whole load of mess because we assume something about how somebody expresses themselves from a gender expression point of view that may not be true about how they identify either as a gender identity or as sexual orientation. So gender expression is really the way in which people present themselves in the world. My attempt is to be as ungendered as possible, but I lean towards kind of the more I think trans masculine is a term that's used. I don't know. But I will tell you that I would not be, I have no desire to put a suit on with a tie. Some people do, not me, have no desire. It could be just I'm lazy and I don't like dressing up, who knows? That may be part of it. But gender expression is how we express ourselves in the world. And that, again, to be clear, is separate from our gender identity. There may be connections to it, but not necessarily. And the connections may be different than the assumptions we might make. So just to be aware of that. When we do the gender unicorn in person, we encourage people to have a conversation with themselves about where they might place themselves on each of the arrows on the gender unicorn. And hopefully you can see some of the little dots that are on the arrows on the diagram there. And something we also do is we encourage people to think of themselves from some of their earliest memories. And if they were filling this out for themselves, maybe at the age of 6, 7, or 8, and where would they place themselves on that journey at that age based on that level of understanding that we had, and then to do it again with their current selves. And it's interesting how people can notice and pay attention to differences in ways in which they have understood themselves on all of these spectrums, really from a younger age until whatever age they are right now. And I think to John's point, getting comfortable with the idea that this can change, and that change is not a bad thing. It's not something to be afraid of or worried about. It's just, part of who we are. So I would definitely encourage you to potentially take a look at that. And then just finally, this is the last slide, and we've already named our pronouns as we've introduced ourselves. One of the things to mention about pronouns is, number one, college kids, school kids now, this is becoming very normal. The idea of presenting our pronouns at the beginning of a meeting so that people know what people's pronouns are. And sometimes the way it's expressed is as preferred pronouns. And I would like you to think of that not as preferred pronouns. I just think of pronouns. If you are female, you identify as a woman, you wouldn't consider she, her as your preferred pronouns. You would probably just consider them as, those are my pronouns. Okay, so let's think about it that way. And let us be hospitable and honoring to one another by really seeking to use the pronouns that a person wishes to be used for them. So there are many more than these that I've written here, all right? She, her, they, them, he, him. There is a link to another link I think that Emily's going to put in there with a much more extended article about the use of pronouns, goes into much more depth about it. But to be aware that there are other non-binary pronouns that people use. I think probably the most common one is they, them. That's a singular they, them. And yes, there are whole articles about why it's okay grammatically. They even have it now, I think, in the Oxford Dictionary, I believe. I don't know. Anyway, so just to be aware of pronouns. Pronoun is a really good way. Honoring people's pronouns is a really good way of honoring a person generally. And again, don't make assumptions about pronouns. If you're not sure about the pronouns to use for somebody, just ask. It's okay to ask. And that, at 12:49, oops, I went a bit long, is the end of the official presentation. And yes, I'd be happy to share the slides.
Helen, thank you so much for sharing your story and your wisdom as you have been on this journey with RMN and with many others along the way. Let me just tell you briefly, we try to respect our time together. So we have 10 more minutes before we close out today's session. I do want to give Dan an opportunity to share just a little bit more about UMATI very briefly, so you know about that extension ministry of RMN. It's a great thing to get plugged in with. And then also, I'm going to go ahead and mention this. Jim, you could say more in a minute, but Jim's going to put in the chat a link to a survey. This is a journey for us. We are seeking as a network and as a movement to be helpful and to be alongside you. And we really would appreciate your feedback about information and topics that you are interested in. We see this as an ongoing conversation. We're going to continue to create these opportunities along the way. So if you would just go ahead and click on that SurveyMonkey link, you can fill it out after we get done here. You don't have to stop and do that now, but that will pull it up in your browser. And after we close out, if you take 1 to 3 minutes just to give us some quick feedback, that would be helpful in us shaping the rest of our times together. We also have 2 more sessions coming up. And those were included in the same Eventbrite link that you registered for this one. So they will be different than today. So they're going to be continued conversation in different ways. We've gotten that question several times. So they will be different conversations that will extend. We wanted to give this as a groundwork for our kind of shared language and moving forward. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dan and ask you, if you would, just to share a little bit more about what is UMATI.
The United Methodist Alliance for Transgender Inclusion is a very active community. Some of what I do in my role as convener is I help to create and facilitate that community online in a safe and protected space. We sometimes develop and curate resources for families, for transgender individuals, provide support for our members, including some of our international members, and even quite explicitly for our international members as well. We've provided social and public witness. Some of that last May, we published an open letter in support of Dr. Rachel Levine, who was receiving some major social media bullying due to her transgender identity, and who is now our new Assistant Health Secretary for the United States. And one of my current projects is working with scholars and liturgical scholars to create resources for clergy to discuss transgender identity as it relates to baptism. So that's kind of what's going on now. And those conversations continue to take place within our space, which is a closed Facebook group for UMATI.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Just wanted to give a little more context. There are great ways to get plugged in. And one of the things we hope you see is that there is a community of people who are wanting to learn together alongside each other. We have used a lot of our time today, but I do want to make sure to capture any questions that you do have. We've seen a couple have come through. We won't have time to answer all of those today, but I'm happy to throw one into our space just as we gather. There will be a link to this video. We will send the PowerPoint, so you'll have these as resources. Those are great questions. But one of the questions that we've gotten here in the chat is related to use of pronouns that is a resistance because of grammar, and that in school, the English teachers have been asking for singular use of pronouns. Helen, I don't know if you would have a response that you might add just as to, or Dan's got it. Dan is like, all right, go for it, Dan.
So one of the things that we tend to hear of is that singular use of pronoun, but we've been using they as a singular pronoun for a very long time in the English language, when we either cannot tell someone's gender identity by their outward expression, or simply because their name is gender neutral and we don't have any other context other than their name. So we've been using they and them as singular pronouns in our English language for at least as long as I can remember. So it's one of those things that it shouldn't be that hard. It is. They and them are not explicitly plural pronouns.
Thank you. That's helpful. And I'd like to say one of the things that I love discovering, I'm a United Methodist pastor. And as we look, while there are in our book of discipline, there are some definitely harmful language that we have, as you all, I'm sure, are aware, are working to understand and work through as a denomination. But it is cool that if you look at the United Methodist hymnal and look at baptismal vows, that because, and this is kind of a still in a binary system, was thinking like, we don't know if it's going to be a male or female, but they and there are used to say that's where you're going to insert something. And I just think it's lovely that that is already present in some of our written documents, and we can simply just use them and there, and not have to identify a gender in that. So I think that's a cool thing just to know. Friends, we are at our time, and I do want to make sure to let you know about the next two sessions a little bit more in detail. I said they would be different, and it is going to be a time to unfold some of these questions that you are raising now, or that might be coming up. So we would encourage you to capture those and record those. If you want to send them to us, you have my email. It's emily@rmnetwork.org. Or if you just want to hold on to those for the next two sessions, like I said, we will be getting to more conversation, kind of interview, question and answer mode. But we hope that this was helpful to you, to help us to kind of create a baseline, a shared use of language as we all continue in this journey to support and affirm our LGBTQ loved ones, and so that you can be a good ally and support to those in your life along the way. So thank you for joining us again. We'd appreciate you filling out that Survey Monkey. Helen is wanting to add something.
I just want to let you know, I did put a link to the slides, a PDF of the slides. I know Emily's going to email it out, but if you look in the chat, there is a link there.
Yes, thank you indeed. And Jim, did you have anything, or Dan, that y'all wanted to mention before we hop off today's call?
I just want to say thanks to everyone for being here. Thanks especially to Helen and Dan and John, and you also, Emily. Emily's had a moving experience the last few days. She and her wife just moved into a new home, and she does all the kind of behind the scenes stuff to make these calls possible. And we just thank her so much for her work in this as well. Someone asked if the presentation is being recorded. It will be available later, and I think it will be, Emily.
Yes, correct. And John, did you have something that you wanted to add?
Yes, to the pronoun conversation. This was mind-blowing to me and to most of my friends that I have told to this point, because it's something that's so ingrained we don't even realize it. You is a plural pronoun. Mm. That's why we say you are and not you is. So if you're having problems and people start getting nasty, say, fine, you can't use you anymore. You get to go back to thou. That is the singular form of you. So there's ways and there's resources. I also did want to say, the name scrolled up too far. Susie posted the link to the singular they Wikipedia in the chat as well. And that could be really helpful for not snarky answers. I'm really good at the snarky ones.
That's awesome. John, thank you for that humorous note to close us out. Jim, would you just send us out with a brief blessing for our day together?
God, you have created us all in your image, and your image and who you are is beyond our comprehension. We thank you with the diversity of all of our lives, who you created us to be, the gifts you've given us, your presence with us now. Dismiss us now with your love and grace. This we ask in your name and for your sake. Amen.
Amen. Go in peace this day, and thank you for joining us. We hope to see you back again with us soon. Take care, everyone.